It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in the heart of Savannah, Georgia. The kind of day where the breeze felt just right and people wandered the aisles of their neighborhood grocery store with no urgency. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Carter, a 54-year-old Army officer known for her decades of service overseas. But here, dressed in a soft gray t-shirt, jeans, and running shoes, she looked like any other shopper. There were no medals on her chest, no salute to greet her, and no soldiers at her side. Just Michelle, a reusable tote in hand, browsing through the snack aisle, enjoying a rare moment of peace. After months on base and a recent return from a high-pressure deployment, the simplicity of choosing her favorite granola bar was a small but welcome luxury. But peace, Michelle knew, never lasted long. From the other end of the aisle, a tall man in a crisp police uniform turned the corner. He walked with an air of authority, scanning the shelves distractedly. He carried a packet of spaghetti and a soda which suddenly slipped from his grip and crashed to the ground. The bottle rolled a few feet, fizzing violently, while noodles sprawled across the polished floor. Michelle paused. It was the kind of everyday accident that could happen to anyone. What struck her wasn't the spill, it was what came next. Officer Daniel Reeves, a name Michelle would only learn later, glanced briefly at the mess, shrugged, and walked away without a second thought. No one else was nearby. No staff, no immediate witnesses. Just Michelle, standing quietly with her tote, watching the scene unfold. To someone else it might have seemed small, insignificant even, but to Michelle, who had spent years instilling discipline, responsibility, and respect in young soldiers, this wasn't just a clumsy moment, it was a reflection. A uniform worn without honor. She stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. "Excuse me, sir, you dropped something back there. Might be good to clean it up so others don't slip." The officer turned slowly, giving her a once-over like she was beneath notice. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Who are you supposed to be?" he scoffed. "You think I got time for spaghetti? Someone'll clean it up." Michelle didn't flinch. His condescension didn't surprise her. She'd faced worse, in other countries, in tougher terrain, in actual combat, but she wasn't about to let it slide. "As an officer," she said evenly, "you set the tone. Picking up after yourself isn't about the spaghetti, it's about respect." His smirk deepened into a mocking laugh. "Lady, I wear a badge. I don't answer to supermarket shoppers with an attitude." The air grew heavier. People began to glance their way. A couple with a child slowed their cart. An older man near the freezer section took a step closer. Tension moved through the store like a cold front. Michelle stood straighter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look away. "This isn't about authority," she said. "It's about character, and what people see when you wear that badge." Officer Reeves sneered, eyes narrowing. "You don't know the first thing about what it means to wear this badge. You civilians think everything's your business." Michelle held his gaze, her voice like a steady drumbeat in the distance. "I do know what it means to wear a uniform. I've worn one longer than you've probably been on the force." That made him pause, but only for a second. "You military?" he asked, tone dripping with doubt. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her posture spoke volumes. So did her silence. More shoppers had started to gather. A teenage boy took out his phone, quietly filming from behind a cereal display. The hum of overhead lights seemed louder in the tension. Still, Officer Reeves didn't back down. "This your thing? You looking for attention?" he said. "Because you're barking up the wrong tree." Michelle kept her voice measured, but her eyes sharpened. "I'm not looking for anything. I'm reminding you of what it means to represent something bigger than yourself." There it was, a flicker, a twitch at the edge of his jaw. Maybe it was the realization that the crowd had grown. Maybe it was the uncomfortable awareness that he was no longer in control of the moment. Whatever it was, the arrogance in his stance faltered, just slightly. But he doubled down. "Lady, walk away," he said sharply. "Don't make this a thing." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The friendly, slow-paced vibe of a Saturday shop had vanished. In its place was a scene charged with unspoken questions, widening eyes, and phones being lifted discreetly into the air. Michelle didn't walk away. She never did. Not when it mattered. And this was starting to matter more than anyone realized. The crowd was still small but growing. A few shoppers had stopped completely, clutching baskets to their chests, eyes bouncing between the two figures in the aisle. The air was no longer filled with the casual chatter of a grocery run. It had become something else. Quiet, watchful, tense. Michelle Carter didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. But her presence, steady, unshaken, was louder than anything else in that store. Officer Daniel Reeves stood across from her, his arms crossed now, trying to mask his defensiveness with arrogance. "You got some nerve," he said, voice tight, "talking to me like that in front of all these people. I don't know who you think you are, but you're way out of line." Michelle tilted her head just slightly. "I don't think I'm anyone," she replied. "I know who I am. Do you?" It hit harder than he expected. His smirk faltered, just for a moment, and when it did, Michelle knew she wasn't just speaking to him. She was speaking to everyone who had ever been dismissed, spoken over, or ignored, simply because they didn't fit the mold of what respectable looked like. Daniel's face hardened. "You really want to make a scene right now? You don't even know what you're stepping into." Michelle kept her voice calm, measured. "I know exactly what I'm stepping into. This isn't about spilled soda and pasta. It's about how you treat people when you think no one's watching." The teenage boy near the cereal shelf was still filming. Another woman by the dairy section whispered something into her phone. More eyes, more tension, but Michelle's expression never wavered. Daniel took a step closer, trying to tower over her. "I'm the law in this store, in this city, and people like you—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the tone said enough. "People like you." Michelle's heart didn't race. Her breath stayed steady. This wasn't her first confrontation, though it was perhaps one of the most personal, because this wasn't some battlefield in a distant country. This was home. And she had no intention of stepping back. "You wear that badge," she said quietly, "but you forgot what it means. It doesn't make you the law. It means you serve the law, and that starts with how you treat people." He laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "You think some speech is going to change anything? You're just a woman with an attitude." Michelle smiled, not because it was funny, but because the words were so painfully familiar. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she said, her voice still even, "but you're about to find out." Daniel looked around. The expressions on the bystanders' faces weren't amused or supportive. They were concerned, curious, some clearly uncomfortable. The tide was shifting and he could feel it. Still, he pushed forward. "You really want to play hero today? Make some viral video, get your 15 minutes of fame?" Michelle shook her head. "This isn't about fame. It's about accountability, something you clearly don't understand." The silence that followed was deafening. The supermarket moments earlier filled with soft music and beeping scanners had become a theater. A standoff. And everyone had front row seats. One man, perhaps in his 60s, stepped forward hesitantly. "Miss, do you want us to call someone?" Michelle gave him a gentle nod of appreciation, but didn't break eye contact with Daniel. "I've got it under control." Daniel's fingers twitched at his waist, too close to his holster. Michelle noticed it immediately, the way a trained soldier does. Her body stiffened slightly, but her face remained calm. "You don't want to do that," she said quietly. His hand froze. Maybe he realized it too. The line he was about to cross, the cameras, the crowd, the woman in front of him who wasn't afraid, not even a little. "You don't scare easy, do you?" he asked. "No," she answered, "because I've faced down real threats. And they didn't wear name tags and carry grocery bags." A ripple of nervous laughter came from somewhere in the crowd. The tension didn't break, but it cracked. Slightly. Daniel took a half step back, face flushed. "You're making a mistake." Michelle shook her head slowly. "No, the mistake was yours. When you assumed that power gave you permission to disrespect people." There was a pause, a long one. Then Daniel said, "It's going nowhere." She replied, "Not for you, maybe, but for everyone watching, it's going exactly where it needs to." The words hung in the air. And though no sirens had sounded yet and no reinforcements had arrived, the energy had shifted. Michelle wasn't just a woman standing up for herself. She had become a symbol. Quietly, calmly, without even meaning to. And Officer Daniel Reeves, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if the badge on his chest would protect him from what came next. The tension in the store was now razor sharp. Every second felt like it was stretched, like time was holding its breath. Officer Daniel Reeves stood rigid, his posture puffed up with false confidence, but his eyes flickered, darting between Michelle, the growing crowd, and the multiple cell phones now pointed in his direction. Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Carter didn't flinch. She remained exactly where she was, calm and unwavering. Her back was straight, shoulders squared, not in defiance, but in dignity. And that terrified him far more than any angry outburst ever could. Daniel tried again. "I'm telling you, back off. You're making this worse for yourself." Michelle slowly reached into her back pocket. The entire aisle seemed to hold its breath. But instead of pulling anything threatening, she retrieved her phone. Not quickly, not aggressively. She tapped the screen, lifted it to her ear, and spoke in a clear, level voice. "Hello, yes, I'm at the corner of Whitaker and Liberty inside the Riverway Market. I'm requesting immediate assistance. There's an officer here who's abusing his authority and threatening civilians." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You seriously calling this in?" She didn't look at him. "Yes, because someone needs to." He scoffed, then took a step forward. "Do you know what kind of trouble you're walking into? Do you really think you're going to win this?" Michelle finally looked back at him, her tone low and deliberate. "This isn't about winning. This is about drawing the line." Behind her, murmurs started to ripple through the store. A woman whispered, "She's right." A man muttered, "He's out of line." People were no longer passive observers. They were slowly, cautiously, choosing a side. And it wasn't his. Outside, faint sirens began to wail in the distance. Daniel heard it too. His nostrils flared, his bravado cracking. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped, stepping closer again. Michelle didn't back down. "What you should have done from the start, standing up for what's right." The sirens grew louder, then they stopped. The silence afterward was deafening. Within seconds, the automatic doors whooshed open and 2 patrol officers entered, followed by a tall man in a navy blue suit with a gold city seal pinned to his lapel. It was Mayor James Whitmore, a respected leader known throughout Savannah for his no-nonsense approach to justice. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He walked in like a thunderstorm, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Michelle. His pace slowed. His expression shifted from stern to respectful. "Colonel Carter," he said, nodding, "I received your call." Daniel's eyes widened. "Wait, Colonel?" Michelle turned slightly, acknowledging him. "Mr. Mayor, thank you for coming so quickly." James glanced toward Daniel, his voice sharp. "Is this the officer?" "He is," she said plainly. "His conduct has been recorded and witnessed by multiple people." Daniel immediately raised his hands, his voice high with panic. "This is a misunderstanding, sir. She was being combative. I was just trying to de-escalate." The mayor didn't bite. "You mean the same woman who served 3 tours overseas and holds the Distinguished Service Medal for Valor Under Fire?" Daniel stammered, I didn't know who she was." "And that," the mayor interrupted, "is exactly the problem." He turned to one of the responding officers and nodded. In a swift, silent motion, Daniel Reeves was disarmed. His badge and sidearm were removed with clinical precision. The store was silent except for the hushed sound of phones still recording, still documenting every second. Daniel's face went pale. "You can't just—" "I can," the mayor said, "and I will." Michelle stood silently, her arms now folded across her chest. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't triumphant. But there was a subtle shift in her stance, a quiet kind of justice. The mayor turned back to her. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "I'm fine. But this isn't just about me. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked. I didn't stand up today for myself. I stood up because someone had to." The mayor looked around the store. Every eye was on them. "You've reminded us why integrity matters more than authority," he said. Then, turning to the crowd, he added, "And you've all witnessed exactly what accountability should look like." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling, not out of celebration but out of recognition, out of respect. As Daniel Reeves was escorted out of the store, his head low and his future unraveling, Michelle Carter remained rooted in place, calm, solid, and unshaken. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't issued threats, but she had changed everything. The applause faded slowly, but the silence that followed was even louder. The weight of what had just happened didn't lift. It deepened. The crowd stood still, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, respect. Officer Daniel Reeves was now a shadow of the man who had strutted into that aisle minutes ago, badge gone, gun holstered by someone else. The last shred of arrogance had melted off his face, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who finally realized he wasn't untouchable. As he was led out of the store by two officers, the mayor's voice followed him. "An investigation will begin immediately, and rest assured, this won't be buried." Daniel said nothing. For the first time, he had no words left. Michelle Carter watched him disappear through the sliding doors. Her expression remained calm, but inside something loosened. Not victory, because this wasn't a game, it was relief. A small exhale after holding her breath through years of knowing what it felt like to be dismissed, undermined, or told to calm down. But she wasn't finished. Mayor Whitmore turned to her, his tone softer now. "Colonel Carter, what you did here today, it mattered. A lot." Michelle gave a slight nod. "It's not just about one man's behavior, it's about the culture that allows it." He nodded slowly, understanding the larger picture. "You're right, and we'll be addressing that. This department, our entire system, we can't afford to ignore this anymore." A woman from the crowd stepped forward, early 30s, holding her phone with shaking hands. "I got it all," she said. "I recorded the whole thing, from when he first raised his voice." She handed the phone to one of the officers. Another man, maybe in his 40s, added, "He harassed my brother last year, but we didn't know how to fight back." "Thank you for standing up." Michelle looked at him, then at the others beginning to speak up. Their stories were different, but the pain in their eyes was familiar. This wasn't just about her anymore, it never was. By evening, the video footage had made its way onto local news, then national outlets. Headlines screamed across social media. "Army veteran confronts cops' abuse of power," and "wins." The footage showed the moment Daniel raised his voice, the cold dismissiveness in his tone, and Michelle's unwavering presence in contrast. People shared the video by the thousands, then the hundreds of thousands, and the messages started pouring in. Former soldiers, single mothers, retired teachers, young kids who had never seen someone calmly hold their ground under pressure. Michelle didn't respond to most of them, not because she didn't care, but because she didn't do it for praise. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She had always believed that power should be used to serve, not to intimidate. And that day in the supermarket, she had simply lived by that belief. But the world had noticed. Within days, the Savannah Police Department released an official statement confirming Officer Reeves's suspension and the launch of an internal affairs investigation. Then came word from other citizens who had dealt with him in the past. Complaints that had been ignored were now reopened. Testimonies poured in. The reckoning had begun. Meanwhile, Michelle received a quiet invitation from the city to speak at a special seminar on ethics in law enforcement. She declined at first. She wasn't a speaker, she was a soldier. But after some thought, she agreed, not because she wanted a spotlight, but because she knew change only happens when people keep showing up. At the event, she stood in front of a room filled with officers, cadets, and city officials. Her message was clear and firm. You don't earn trust with a badge. You earn it with how you treat people when you think no one's watching. The room was still. Some took notes, others simply listened. But something was different. There was a shift, subtle but real. And back home, Michelle returned to her usual quiet life. She went on morning walks. She volunteered at the local community center. She declined every interview that asked to paint her as a hero. She didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as someone who did what had to be done, because silence to her had never been an option. Officer Reeves, on the other hand, faced formal charges of misconduct and abuse of power. His past actions were no longer hidden in paperwork and procedural dead ends. The system that once shielded him now held him accountable. And as the community watched it unfold, many realized something important. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it stands calm in the middle of a storm, refusing to move. That's what Michelle Carter had done. And the echo of that moment was just getting started. Weeks passed. The headlines eventually faded. The news cycle moved on. Social media turned its attention to the next trending topic. But in Savannah, Georgia, the impact of what happened inside that little neighborhood supermarket never really left. Because some stories don't disappear, they settle deep into a community's bones. Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Carter never expected to be part of a movement. She didn't ask for applause, cameras, or recognition. In her mind, she had simply done what was right, what was necessary, and once the dust settled, she quietly returned to her life. But life didn't return to what it had been before. The community now saw her not just as the quiet woman who walked her dog at sunrise or volunteered with veterans on Saturdays. She had become something more, a symbol of quiet strength, of standing tall when it counted. And even though Michelle tried to keep a low profile, her story had sparked something far bigger than she imagined. Across the city, conversations began to change. Police departments in nearby towns started reviewing internal complaints more seriously. The city council approved funding for ethics and de-escalation training, and community centers invited Michelle to speak, not to lecture. At first she said no. Public speaking was never her thing. She was a soldier, trained to lead from the front lines, not behind podiums. But eventually something shifted. She met a young woman, barely 20, at a small town hall event. The girl stood in the back, quiet, almost shy. When the event ended, she came up to Michelle and said, "I watched your video. I was always scared to speak up when something felt wrong, but because of you, I'm not anymore." That was the moment Michelle understood. This wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about what her action represented, what it ignited in people who had gone unheard for far too long. So she started saying yes, not for fame, not for praise, but because her voice, steady and reasoned, had become a reminder that courage doesn't always look like shouting. It often looks like standing your ground and refusing to shrink. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves' career unraveled, publicly and painfully. What began as a suspension quickly turned into termination, then legal charges for abuse of authority and making threats while armed. During his hearings, more people stepped forward. Stories from past encounters, once buried, were now impossible to ignore. He didn't speak much in court. When he did, he looked nothing like the man who once mocked Michelle in that supermarket aisle. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just a tired man who had finally learned that power without integrity is nothing but a costume. The court found him guilty of misconduct and intimidation. His badge was never returned, his future in law enforcement over. And the city issued a formal apology to Michelle Carter. But she never paraded that victory. Instead, she focused on the legacy, not hers, but what came next. She helped launch a community-driven initiative called Stand with Honor, a local program designed to teach young people, especially girls and minorities, about self-advocacy, ethics, and leadership. The program partnered with schools, police departments, and veteran groups, turning what was once a viral moment into real, sustainable change. And perhaps most meaningful to Michelle, young cadets at the local police academy began quoting her in their training sessions. One of their first lessons now opened with her words, "A badge doesn't give you power, character does." Still, Michelle remained humble. When asked how she stayed so composed in that moment, she always gave the same answer: discipline and a lifetime of knowing what matters. To her, it had never been about shouting down a man with a badge. It had been about lifting up a standard, about making sure that no one, no matter their uniform, rank, or status, was allowed to abuse the trust that society placed in them. And when people called her a hero, she would smile kindly and say, "No, I'm just a citizen, and citizens have responsibilities too." In the end, Michelle Carter didn't just walk out of that supermarket with her dignity intact. She walked out having planted a seed, one that grew into policy change, community empowerment, and a renewed belief that ordinary people can hold the line when justice is threatened. And though the world may forget hashtags and headlines, in Savannah her legacy endures in the classrooms, in the police stations, and in every quiet person who finally decides they won't be silent anymore. Because one woman stood tall, and everyone else saw what was possible. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a woman confronting a corrupt officer. It was a story about integrity, about the power of staying calm when others expect you to break. It was about one person, Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Carter, choosing to stand her ground, not with anger, not with violence, but with dignity, discipline, and unshakable purpose. She didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She simply refused to be silent. And because of that, policies changed, conversations began, and people who once felt powerless found a voice. Michelle reminded all of us of a truth that's easy to forget. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to have a title to make a difference. And sometimes doing the right thing means standing up when it's hardest. This story isn't about being a hero. It's about being human and choosing courage when fear would be easier. So the next time you're faced with something unfair, big or small, remember Michelle. You don't need a badge. You don't need a rank. You just need the courage to say, "This isn't right." If you felt inspired by Michelle's story, comment the number 1 below. If you think we can improve or tell even better stories, comment 0. I read every message and want to grow with you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if stories like this move you. Together we can turn quiet moments into powerful movements. Thanks for watching, and remember, character is louder than power.